It was the chronicler Thomas Walsingham who described Edward III's mistress, Alice Paris, as an unspeakable WH word. He wasn't her only enemy. In 1376, there even was a new ordinance banning women from doing business in the courts that mentioned her by name, especially Alice Paris, on penalty of whatever the said Alice can forfeit and of being banished from the realm. In other words, the ordinance was created for one purpose only, to get rid of Alice. This actually happened, well, for a certain time. Walsingham informs us about her crimes that brought the wrath of her contemporaries upon Alice. She had gone far beyond the limits set for women, and forgetting her femininity and her frailty, she had on some occasions sat beside the king's justices, and on others placed herself next to the doctors in the ecclesiastical court, and had not been in the least afraid of urging her point of view in defense of the accused, or even making demands which were contrary to the laws. It sounds a lot like she behaved like a man, and that just didn't work in the 14th century England. But it's not that simple. Over the centuries, Alice was described in many ways. Words like scapegoat, businesswoman, and manipulator were used. They're all probably true in some way. Let's have a look. Walsingham's Chronica Majora is the source that provides us with the most information about Alice. And this is a problem. The man hated her. He himself not only lived at the same time, but probably knew her personally. He was a monk in St. Albans during the time the abbey had some business conflicts with her. And Alice wasn't shy to use her relationship to the aging and half-demented king for her advantage. It's no wonder that Walsingham describes her in very colorful and certainly not flattering ways. Therefore, his accounts were mostly seen as false. They were gleefully repeated during the 19th century because of their scandalous nature, but even back then they weren't taken for granted. They didn't seem to make sense. According to Walsingham, Alice was from lower birth. She was the daughter of a settler from East Hannay. How could a woman with such an infamous origin not only become the damsel of Queen Philippa, but even the mistress of the king and the mother of at least 3 of his children? Therefore, historians started to search for another explanation than the one Walsingham provided. This already happened in the 19th century as well, and they found one. There was a Sir Richard Paris that had his own fair share of fights with St. Albans. Alice must have been his daughter, the historians concluded. It was perfect. She was from noble birth, that explained her access to the royal family, and it proved that Walsingham lied. But he didn't, at least not in this regard. Around the year 2000, a deed was found that confirmed Alice's lower birth and a marriage before she came to court. It informed about a death of a man called Jan in Paris that he accepted for his wife Alice for some clothes. This man was no stranger to the royal court. Edward III mentioned him himself in 1359. The king described him as our jeweler. This explains how Alice got access. As a side note, there's also a report that Alice was a mistress to a merchant from Lombardy. This was probably Janin. For a modern historian, this whole thing is a mess. It's hard to judge which sources and research results are trustworthy. Let's try to make sense of the story of a woman who successfully fends off any attempt to pigeonhole her. There is no birth record for Alice. The years 1342 and 1348 are often mentioned. The first one seems more plausible to me than the second one. Janin Paris' deed is from 1360. It's not impossible that she was already married, being 12 years old. More likely is that she was 18. Her husband dies in the early 1360s. I have found the years 1361 and 1364 as possibilities. Given that she is named a damsel of the queen, I think there's a misunderstanding in the previous research. Damsel has two meanings. If a royal court is involved, it means most of the time a lady of noble birth who shows a certain level of virtue and modesty. Outside of that, it is the term for a young woman. The phrase damsel in distress is well known to describe such a woman that needs help. I think this is the correct meaning for Alice's role at the court. In the beginning, the queen took her in after her husband died to help her. Modern research backs this up, well, at least a little bit. We know that women from lower birth could serve the queen. Edward discovered her, let's say, charm shortly after. There's the widespread assumption that he only started the affair with her after the death of his wife in 1369. I think this information is wrong and based on accounts that want to defend the honor of the monarch in this question. The affair probably started shortly after she arrived. It was her influence that got a boost after the death of the queen. Edward even gave her some of the jewels of his late wife, which was a big scandal. This happened in 1373. Between 1370 and 1376, Alice became extremely powerful. She gave birth to a son and two daughters of the king. They got the very, say, easy to remember names John, Joan, and Jane. Kids helped to secure her position. Maybe there were even more children, but this is uncertain. Alice used her influence to help friends and people who could afford her friendship, but we will come back to this point later. During these years, she built a gigantic fortune as well. Edward alone gave her presents in the worth of £20,000. Today, this would be more than £6 million. 1 week after Edward's death, she had around £780,000 in today's money in cash at one of her homes. Her downfall began in 1376 and was part of a larger development. There was a rising unsatisfaction with the king. Several of his ministers were impeached. Alice was sent away by the king during the summer of the year because she violated the ordinance. But she was back as early as October 1376. The king pardoned her for breaking the ordinance on October 22nd, 1376. That is why we know she is back. The ordinance was never revoked, which became a problem for her. 1 year later, after Edward's death, the first parliament of Richard II put her on trial and banned her for breaking the ordinance. It ignored the pardon. She lost all her fortune, but not forever. She was allowed to return around 2 years later and won almost all her fortune back. Alice died in the winter of 1400 to 1401. Alice acquired 56 castles, manors, and townhouses during 1370 and 1376 that were spread all over the country. Some of them were gifts by the king, but she initiated most of the deals herself. She acted as a sole femme. This is a legal term that means she was a single woman that didn't have a husband to represent her. But she finished only a fraction of her deals in her own right. Most of the times she used a system with loyal male proxies. This helped a lot when she had to regain her fortune later. After Edward's death, she used the proxies 87 times to transfer property. This is a remarkable achievement for that time. It highlights that Alice was extremely intelligent and knew what she was doing. Real estate wasn't the only thing she invested in. She had a soft spot for expensive clothes and gemstones. In 1379, the royal authorities collected 21,868 pearls from her. Some historians have suggested that this speaks for a wish to reinvent herself. Coming from lower birth, she wanted to signal that she had ascended. This seems reasonable to me. Alice also acted as a lender. She gave loans to several people from the nobility, male and female. She probably saw it as an investment in her rank in society. Due to her businesses and her position at the royal court, Alice is seen as the inspiration for Lady Mead in William Langland's Piers Plowman, but the original manuscript was written before her time. It's possible that the author later adapted his text to transform Lady Mead into Alice. She also was one of the inspirations for the Wife of Bath tale. There is no question that Alice's influence on the king was enormous. For example, he presented her in golden garments as the Lady of the Sun in London. Days before his death, he still reimbursed her the money for the golden cup she had bought. Again and again, he followed her pleas when it came to rulings concerning her friends. Laura Tompkins thinks she might have served as a form of financial advisor to the king. As a side note, there's an excellent conference presentation by Dr. Tompkins available, which deals with the good Parliament of 1376, Edward Mortimer, and Alice. I link it in the description. Alice was at least accused to be responsible for some terrible loans the crown signed. One of them had an interest rate of 50%, and it was only one of many. But there's no way to be sure who gave the ultimate push to sign it. Some of those terrible loans were given by Edward's own ministers that were impeached in 1376, and this was the time where the crown was running out of money quickly. This means there were several potential instigators to convince the king into signing the contracts. But back to the relationship between Edward and Alice. The king protected her from any investigations into her doings. For example, the sheriff of Buckingham allegedly simply ignored a complaint against one of Alice's parkers because of the great menaces that would come with such an investigation. When Edward had to exile her from court, he swore he would never see her again. According to Walsingham, but just him, she took a similar oath herself on the cross of an archbishop. I already mentioned the outcome. Alice was away for just 3 to 4 months. It took no longer for the king to demand her return. She had probably the backing of another high-ranking member of the court, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster. After the death of the Black Prince Edward in June 1376, he was the oldest son of the king. He was publicly engaged in an adulterous relationship with Catherine Swynford, a Flemish woman. Maybe he was sympathetic for that reason, but John's stance on Alice changed several times throughout the years. He was not always an ally. It was John who oversaw the actions of the good Parliament against Alice, and there was a bombshell. The news made the rounds that Alice had been married for a second time to William de Windsor, who was more than 20 years older than her. He served as Edward's lieutenant in Ireland for some time. The king commented that he had never started the affair if he had known. We actually don't know if Alice was married to William in 1376. There are several versions about her second marriage. The first one is that Edward pushed her to marry William in secret in the 1370s to be legally protected in the event of his death. Alice didn't meet William before 1372, therefore this is the earliest year for potential marriage. More probable is a wedding in 1374 or 1375. Sometimes November 1375 is given as a fact, but we cannot say this with certainty. When Richard II's parliament put her on trial in 1377, they treated her as a single woman. There are several possible reasons for that. First, she indeed wasn't married at the time, and the news in 1376 was false. She married William later. Second, she was married to William, but the parliament didn't want to embarrass the late king and the grandfather of the current one with an official statement that he was engaged in an adulterous affair. It is possible that this was the reason there was no trial in 1376. The elites had a huge problems how to rein in Edward's go-getting mistress without exposing him. The parliament knew she was married but wanted to trial her as a single woman to give her husband the chance to appeal the judgment. The last option has the charm that it is close to what happened. William complained that the parliament falsely tried her as single even though she was his wife. This was successful. The parliament revoked its former judgment in 1379. Alice was allowed to return, and this time for good. As part of a trial in December 1377, several accusations against her were made public. To give two examples, Winchester's Bishop William Wykeham bribed Alice to enlarge his influence with the king. Edmund and Marjorie de Broc accused her to have stolen the manor by force. Allegedly, she came with several armed men to their house, imprisoned Edmund, and demanded that Marjorie would divorce him. None of these people had come forward before, but there is no proof that these were lies. The stories of the accusers are consistent, so I'm inclined to believe them. This isn't the case for several of the accusations Walsingham made against her. He wrote that she wanted all of Edward's properties. When she knew the king was dying, she even thought about fleeing. According to the chronicler, her greed was too great to do so. She stayed and even took the rings from the fingers of the dying king. But there was no apparent reason for her to flee. Edward had pardoned her, and the country had to find a solution how a 10-year-old could be king. In this moment, she was of secondary importance. So, what can we make of Alice? Was she evil like many people of her time thought? Was she a brilliant businesswoman who had the misfortune to be born with the wrong gender for her time, as it is sometimes stated during our days? As I already have indicated, I think that everything is partly true. Alice was brilliant but ruthless. She used what she had to climb the social ladder. That she was a woman certainly didn't help her in the eyes of her contemporaries. But this wasn't the main reason she finally fell. Alice was the favorite of the king, and those are always hated, male or female. For comparison, Alice had almost a happy end compared to other king favorites like Piers Gaveston or Hugh Despenser. Both were rumored to be lovers of Edward II, so they maybe even had this job in common with her. To conclude, Alice did nothing that was uncommon for the time, but she had to learn the hard way that favorites always fall the second the king dies.